There is obviously a great deal of concern around the globe about the rise of what is often called militant Islam. And the topic that is on the agenda for us to discuss this morning is indeed this seemingly sudden rise of militancy in modern Islam. What I'd like to do is I'd like to do a bit of history for us, just to kind of refresh some of our memories. This may stretch you going back to a high school history class or something like that, but I think it's really important for us to put into perspective a few things. Most modern historians of Islam, particularly at the traditional university course structure that we have here in the United States, attribute the rise of militancy in modern Islam to events that occurred at the close of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th centuries. As you probably know, the 19th century was a remarkable season of nation building and empire building around the globe, but particularly in Western Europe. It was in the 19th century that countries like Germany and Italy and Spain actually became unified nation states for the very first time. We often think that places like Germany and Italy and Spain were around for forever. We even talk about things like Christopher Columbus sailing for Spain. But that is in fact a misnomer. There was no Spain when Christopher Columbus sailed. He sailed for Castile and Aragon. Queen Isabella was the Queen of Castile, and King Ferdinand was the King of Aragon. They were married, but they had separate countries with separate administrations and separate currencies, and that was the case all the way up until the middle of the 19th century, when a new ideological movement began to move out of the ivory towers of Enlightenment thinkers and into political structures, with men like Bismarck in Germany uniting all of those tiny German republics and principalities into what we today know of as Germany, and Garibaldi uniting the Italian peninsula and eliminating what was as late as 1868 some 37 separate national jurisdictions into the one country we know of as Italy. So the 19th century saw a tremendous amount of that. It also saw a number of internecine wars, what we commonly today call civil wars. The American experience in the 19th century was not unusual. This was going on. This kind of conflict between visions and worldviews was going on all over the Western world due to this new vision called nationalism. By the end of the 19th century, with the Western industrial powers kind of taking the lead in the world, nationalism was entrenched as sort of the ideological norm for the world. All of the greatest intellectuals believed that amalgamating nations together was the path towards progress and ultimately peace and even modernity. As a result, when the great empires began to collapse at the beginning of the 20th century, empires like the Ottoman Empire, the great intellectuals saw the opportunity to redraw the map of the world. That is sort of the background of Woodrow Wilson's thinking when he went into the Treaty of Versailles at the end of World War I as the sole remaining economic superpower in the world. We oftentimes think of the collapse of communism as catapulting the United States to the forefront of nations, but we often forget that at the end of World War I, virtually all of the great economic powers of the world had exhausted themselves in terrible, terrible wars that had depleted their treasuries, stolen away the youth and the future leadership of the lands, and catapulted the United States into the major player. Woodrow Wilson went into the Treaty of Versailles, having been involved in World War I for only about 9 months. The United States came out of that conflict fairly unscathed, whereas Germany and England, even Russia, who had just gone through their great Bolshevik revolution, Japan, who had been involved in internecine warfare with Russia for some 25 years, all of the great nations were just exhausted. So Woodrow Wilson, a Princeton-educated intellectual with feverish dreams of modernity, driving his vision of the world, sat down and decided to redraw the map of the world. And he did. The result was that we got a number of wonderful new nation states that had not existed prior to this. You may have heard of these. In fact, they may be on your list as potential vacation spots sometime in the near future. Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Palestine, later known as Transjordan, the original Palestine, not the new vision of Palestine that we moderns think of, Kuwait, Hejaz, which was ultimately later conquered by the Saud family and became Saudi Arabia. Yemen, Oman, Bahrain, the United Arab Emirates, the modern Iran, and the solidified national entity we know of as Afghanistan, Uzbekistan, Georgia, Armenia, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Somalia, Yugoslavia, that modern marvel of ideological cohesiveness, and Indonesia. All of these did not exist as nation states prior to Woodrow Wilson's vision of redrawing the map of the world. Now, there's one thing that we ought to know about experts. G.K. Chesterton said it very well when he said, "I am always distrustful of experts because they lack the one great propensity of human civilization, the propensity to repent." Experts seem to plow ahead in spite of history, in spite of facts. There's this notion that somehow progress will cover a multitude of sins. However, the progress does not cover a multitude of sins, as the 20th century, the bloodiest century in all of human history, in fact, a century more bloody than every other single century combined, proved that Woodrow Wilson's vision was not as adept or as workable as he thought. Part of the problem was that nations were thrown together with their lifelong, clan-long, history-long enemies. So, for instance, in Yugoslavia, we had a nation that was literally made up of 7 different countries with 6 different languages and 5 different kingdoms stretching back to prior to the medieval age, divided across 2 great divides, the old Ottoman world and the old Habsburg world. Suddenly, they were supposed to live together. Suddenly, they were supposed to be a single federated nation state. That is a prescription for rebellion, for civil war, and ultimately for terrorism. When the aspirations of old tribal enmities are suppressed by mere force, it is inevitable that the pressure will emerge somewhere else. Now, the old Ottoman Empire had come into existence through the old caliphate system, which I'll talk about in a second. A remarkable remainder, not a Quranic institution, but a remainder of Muhammad's vision when he died in 632. But it had essentially held together the old remnants of the Islamic world for several centuries. Most of those centuries were centuries of decline. In fact, ever since September the 11th of the year 1624, when the last major siege on the west by Suleiman the Magnificent took place outside the walls of the city of Vienna, the Ottoman world had been in serious decline. And that date remains a mark of infamy in Islamic history. The Ottomans were despised by many of the tribal groups and the various aspiring factions within Islam, but it held a lid on things. The end of World War I, with the breakup of the Ottoman Empire, suddenly these new national entities with national leaders handpicked by the Western intellectuals, various kinds of royal families, nationalists, socialists, and revolutionaries, sort of picked from the university rosters at the University of Paris or Cambridge or Oxford. These fellows were thrown in. Naturally, the radicals in all of those nations came to despise both what Woodrow Wilson and the Western intellectuals had done and their puppet regimes that had been put into place. The result was a series of assassinations. The king of Iraq, for instance, who was a member of the Hashemite family. The Hashemite family received several kingdoms. They received the kingdom of Hejaz, they received the kingdom of Transjordan, they received the kingdom of Iraq, they received the kingdom of Alan, which ultimately was swallowed up like Hejaz into the Saudi Arabian emirate and ultimately kingdom. And people like the Hashemites were despised. Radicals grew up around them. All kinds of bizarre factions began to emerge as mainstays. The Wahhabis and the fringe Shiites emerged, and it created havoc within the region. Now, I've given you that quick survey because generally, modern historians attribute the rise of radical militant Islam in the present to the growth, maturity, development, and organization of those rival factions following World War I in reaction to Woodrow Wilson's plan of dividing up the world artificially and making a rational, sensible plan out of the map of the world. That's a long way to go for me to tell you I don't think that is the case. All that I've just told you is true, and all that I've just told you is important for us to keep in mind. We live in a very unstable environment because it's a fairly recent innovation in political affairs imposed by the West upon the Middle East, as well as much of the rest of the world. But that is not why we're seeing militant Islam come to the fore right now. It's a pretext for it, context for it, but it's not the reason for it. It's not the root. Let's back up a long way, a very long way. Let's back up to the death of Muhammad in the year 632. Muhammad died without a succession plan. He had created a top-down sort of structure that was a combination of church and state and culture, all woven into a single fabric. And when he died, there was no plan to succeed him. You ever heard of the founder syndrome? Maybe you have it in your business. You have this one dominating figure, and as difficult as they are, they're what holds the whole enterprise together. And if they don't think about what the world is going to look like when they're gone, everybody starts worrying. Everybody starts fretting. There's internecine warfare around the water cooler and the hallway. And Well, in Muhammad's day, when he fell ill and it became apparent that he would not survive, a virtual civil war broke out among his lieutenants. His father-in-law, the man whose daughter, Aisha, the 9-year-old wife of Muhammad, we call that pedophilia today, but in those days it was just his wife. You know, a guy in your 60s having a wife, late 60s, having a wife 9 years old. The father-in-law of Muhammad, the father of Aisha, was a ruthless man who very quickly eliminated all of the top rivals and succeeded to the leadership of what was then really a tribal vision of Arabian nationalism, Islam. Within 2 years, one rival that he did not think of apparently poisoned him. And as a result, in 634, just as Islam was beginning to emerge from the desert and threaten the frontiers of the Christian Middle East, there was another crisis at hand. Again, a warlord by the name of Oman, or Umar, as he is sometimes known, was able to eliminate all of his potential rivals, and he was able to reign supreme, and he did so with an iron fist for the next 10 years, until 644, when a rival that he didn't think of came into his tent one night and slit his throat. As he was dying, he appointed a successor, a very weak man, but someone who, like Umar and Abu Bakr, was related to the royal clan of Muhammad, a fellow by the name of Uthman. Uthman, too, was able, through a good deal of ruthlessness, not on his part necessarily, but by all of his aunts and uncles who were now thrust into the Meccan nobility, they were able to eliminate most of their rivals until the year 656, at which time Uthman was assassinated. This time, they made sure that he was not able to appoint his successor, because when they slit his throat, they slit it all the way through. The plot against Uthman was launched by Aisha, who was now the mother of Islam, and her lover, whose name was Ali, and a remarkably gifted general for Islam, Zubair. Interestingly, 3 days after the coup and the assassination, Zubair was summarily executed himself. Ali, in 661, found himself in a familiar place. Aisha, outraged that he had taken a younger concubine, had him assassinated, and she took up with Ali's young son, Hassan. Hassan saw the writing on the wall. When a civil war broke out, he realized that he was likely to be relieved of his head. And he made a fast escape into the desert. Now, I tell you all of this to give you a quick perspective of a couple of things. In Islam, there is no doctrine of the fall. There is no doctrine of repentance. There is no doctrine of democratic consent. There is only sheer force. Allah is God of force and will. Allah's representatives are representatives assigned to exert that force and will. As a result, in Islam, duty is directly tied to fear and to force. It's one of the reasons why a good Muslim doesn't have to know anything about the Quran, doesn't have to be particularly pious in certain areas of their lives. They simply have to perform their duties. Any of you have read anything about the pillars of Islam? That's not all there is to Islam. But Islam is driven by fear, force, and cultural consent. In other words, the pressure of peers. It's a top-down operation, and therefore Islam has always produced cultures dominated by autocrats, demagogues, driven by fear. Saddam Hussein is not unusual. He is the quintessential Islamic leader. Now, admittedly, Saddam Hussein is essentially a secular socialist from the Ba'athist Party. But most Islamic leaders have not been particularly pious. If you read the stories of the great revered caliphs of the past, you'll begin to see that they were hardly paragons of virtue. In fact, the reality is that in Islam there is no category called virtue. Lying, treachery, and violence are all perfectly permissible as a part of the progress of Islam. It's one of the reasons why the West has always kind of gone mad at the negotiating table with Islamicists. Because lying is okay. It's not bad. It's not a vice. It is a tool for the use of Islam. This short history should give you a glimpse of a couple of things. First of all, should remind us of the fate of those who are not able to maintain force. You ever wonder why most great Islamic leaders today never spend the night, 2 nights in a row in the same bed? And it's not just a result of the teetering power structure in a place like Iraq. We've seen the same thing going on for years in Syria. We've seen the same thing going on for years with the Hashemites in Jordan. Assassinations and coups are the norm because force is the means by which all change, all standardized structuring of policies will be accomplished. That is the nature of Islam. It is not an anomaly for a particular politician or whatever. The other thing that this brief synopsis should show us is the origin of rival factions within Islam. You see, each time there was a leader who was assassinated, the small band of followers who followed that leader and who were devoted to his cause would often be exiled out into the desert, and they would become a separate little faction, oftentimes becoming radical simply because they were driven to the caves. Again, living out of the caves, in exile, hiding out, biding time, waiting for an opportunity to strike again with force and violence is not a new thing. It has gone on from the beginning. Between 632 and 700, there were at least 3 major civil wars within the world of Islam. And the final departure of Hassan, the son of Ali, created the major split between the Sunnis, the followers of Malawi, who was the victor in that particular fight, and Hassan, the son of Ali, the direct descendant of the royal family of Muhammad, going off in the other direction, followers being the Shiites. The Shiites were the minority sent off into the caves, and so they were immediately radicalized. It was an offshoot of the Shiites during some internecine warfare in the Farsi lands to the south and to the west of what is today Iran, right on the border with Iraq. It was internecine warfare there that sent a small offshoot of Bedouins wandering through the deserts, winding up in the heart of the mountains of Saudi Arabia, adjacent to Mecca, that created the Wahhabi sect, the dominating branch of Islam in Saudi Arabia today, and the faith that Osama bin Laden follows. Now, this may sound terribly much like a soap opera, only without the soap. And it is. It's complicated. It's a complicated, tangled web of personalities and relationships, but that's precisely the point. We need to understand the history of Islam as essentially strong personalities lording it over others by sheer power and force. That's the essence of the Islamic worldview. That's one of the reasons why it is so dangerous, not just to Western civilization and to a Christian conception of freedom, but to all civilization. The idea of the Quran that is driven home to everyone, even those who do not read the Quran, is that ultimately this force must dominate the world. Interestingly, the Quran does not call for the conversion of the world. The Quran is not concerned about the ultimate destiny of souls. It's not like the Great Commission, go forth and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. That's not the vision at all. It is simply the exertion of force to bring about a world order. Because the Quran makes specific exceptions for those who are in the order but have not been converted. The Dahima tax, for instance, is a provision for Jews and Christians to live, albeit rather poorly, but to live within this structured order. Here's the bottom line for us. The Islamic worldview is rooted in violence and force as the primary means by which the will of Allah is accomplished in the world. This is one of the reasons why the phenomenon that exists in the Islamic world is so stunning to us when we come to its realization. And that is, no country has ever converted to Islam willingly. No country. Every single Islamic country in the world today was conquered by force of the sword. That means that our policy toward Islam needs to take into full view the reality that negotiations are always going to be of limited value. Force is what Islam understands. The only times in history where Islam has been able to live somewhat peacefully with the West is when Islam has been contained. This is one of the reasons why I believe that we need to realize that the current world crisis is not something that we are going to be able to get out of diplomatically, and ultimately not even militarily. The ultimate solution, according to the scriptures, will never be accomplished by the agency of mere men exercising their wisdom or their expertise. Woodrow Wilson knows that now. If only he had known it when he was alive. There's this old gospel hymn, Resurrected by the Imperials. This dates me, I know, but you may remember it. There will never be any peace until God sits down at the negotiating table. That there is no détente with Islam. This is one of the reasons why it is so striking to me that as Christians we wring our hands over what we're to do about the Islamic world. What madness is this? We know exactly what we're supposed to do. We're supposed to go forth into the world. We're supposed to go forth with the incredible, life-transforming, culture-transforming power of the gospel of Jesus Christ. The hope of freedom in the Middle East is not a peace treaty. It is the establishment of precedent-setting missions. When we trade with Mujahideen in Afghanistan, our first line of negotiation ought to have been, let us bring in missionaries. We'll help you throw off the Russian or the Soviet threat, but let us bring in missionaries. Otherwise, it's no go. Open up, take the pressure off the churches. This week we had another martyr in the church in Iraq. Dear brother, husband, father of 5 children. We won't hear about that when Tom Brokaw does the news tonight. We're not going to hear about it in State Department briefings. But here's the front line of the battle. Zawar was doing the one thing that can change the situation in Iraq. He was living out the life of the gospel. He was seeing the world change one life at a time, one family at a time, one town at a time. That is the only way that this implacable force, this insatiable violence can be met. If the history of the West and of Islam's conflicts can be understood by anyone, we should know that if we crush Islam militarily, they will simply retreat to the caves. It's not time to turn Iraq into a parking lot. It's time to win them. It's time for us to use the incredible resources that we have to win over families. I love what Servant Group is doing in northern Iraq. Serving the children. Giving the children an opportunity to have an American high school diploma. Teaching them the English language. And how? By bringing to them the gospel. What a glorious thing it is to hear these children in northern Iraq singing songs of genuine freedom, the freedom that comes through Jesus Christ. Here is where, as Christians, we need to be thinking not as American imperialists driven by a State Department line of ideological cohesiveness in the world. We've seen what that has brought us. Woodrow Wilson gave us the 20th century, and what a gift it was. This is an opportunity for the Church of Jesus Christ to come alive and do what the church has always done best, by proclaiming the gospel, blessing the rest of the world with freedom, prosperity, and opportunity. There will never be any peace until God sits down at the negotiating table. The history of Islam, the rise of radical Islam has not been an anomaly. We've given a pretext for it, and we've funded it with our technology in the oil fields, but that has not been the reason that radical Islam has erupted. In a oftentimes erudite work, Bernard Lewis, in his book, What Went Wrong, essentially argues that radical Islam is a reaction against modernity. If he gets as much wrong about Islam as he gets wrong about Christianity, the whole book is suspect. But the one thing that is striking is that he never takes seriously the character and the nature of Islam itself. He creates this kind of moral equivalency that simply does not exist. What we've got to do at this point is kind of turn the corner from fear and loathing to mission. Turn the corner from simply trying to find a way to counter violence with violence, counter force with force, and genuinely bring the hope of the gospel to this tortured portion of the world. I'm convinced that part of the reason that we've not had more success in this part of the world is that we've tried to fight fire with fire. We've tried to meet force with force. Now, there are plenty of opportunities for us to defend ourselves, and I'm not taking a pacifist line at all. I certainly believe that we're in a perilous position and that God, in His good providence, has afforded us the United States military to protect our families and to hedge off threats against the Western way of life. But that's only a temporary solution. That buys us time. It buys us time to do our job. The rise of militant Islam in our day is a testimony to the lack of initiative of the Church of Jesus Christ to do its job, to proclaim the gospel. Woodrow Wilson did not create this mess. He just aggravated it a bit. We created this mess by not doing our job. All right, we've got a little bit of time before you need to go for your daily bread. And so why don't we throw things open for Q&A. And Wally's back there waving at me. I don't know if he's saying, cut it off, or no, he's saying go. Okay, questions? Yes? Prime Minister of Iraq is Tariq Aziz. And he's not from northern Iraq, but he is a Nestorian. Tariq Aziz is a Nestorian. A couple of things that we should understand. Iraq has more Christians in Orthodox, in the Orthodox tradition and in the Nestorian tradition. And some would question whether Nestorian is actually a Christian. It's an old 4th century heresy that was condemned in the early ecumenical councils by the church fathers. It was a thriving thing that survives essentially only in Iraq and Kuwait. And Tariq Aziz is a Nestorian. One of the reasons why a Nestorian can rise to such prominence is the Ba'athist Party, Saddam Hussein's party, and the party that dominates politics in Syria as well. The Ba'athists are a secular socialist party. Yeah, I don't think, first of all, you have to understand the media doesn't think that religion is important at all. And so it's not any big deal. And the media oftentimes, in its naivete, assumes that the whole world is pretty much just as pluralistic as we are, and so they don't see that as an anomaly necessarily.
George, is the notion then in Iraq for us to go in?
Yes, I think, one of the great lessons of the American frontier was the shameful treatment of Native Americans. The United States government, from the Washington administration on, had a policy of making the Indians Americans by using the pretext of religion. And the result was the aim of the government was to make Americans, not to make Christians. And the church became a pawn of that policy. And the result was that we saw broken treaty after broken treaty, shameful treatment after shameful treatment, culminating in the awful calamity of the Trail of Tears. When you approach things from that kind of pragmatic perspective, you wind up with disaster. Now, to say that there are some short-term goals that we could accomplish, that's all well and good. But if our long-term goal is the democratization of Iraq, we're barking up the wrong tree. It's like backing the Shah. One day, that's going to come and bite us right in the behind. All philosophies have an aspect of metaphysics to them. And so in one sense, you could say all philosophies are religion. And you could say all religions are philosophies. the more comprehensive and total a worldview is, the more it's going to swallow up all of those disciplines that we like to kind of keep separated from religion. One of the things about Islam is that it self-consciously swallows up everything within it. So it becomes a monolithic construct. In that sense, it very much is an ideology rather than a faith of piety. There are many good Muslims who will readily admit that though they profess faith in Allah, that there is no sense that Allah is even a personal God. It's more like a force. And because the whole structure is based upon force, it's almost like, Darth Vader's trusting in the dark side. And that is not understood personally. Now, the Sunnis are theists. But as we've seen recently, it's the Wahhabis and the Shiites who are leading the radical edge of militant Islam. And oftentimes, Shiites are not even theists. So it really is an ideology rather than a religion of piety. I think that one of the things that is remarkable about work among the Kurds, the Kurds have been an oppressed people, a dispossessed people in the Islamic world. The opportunity to minister to them is really opened up partly because they've looked around and they've seen their own Islamic brothers bombing them, committing atrocities against them, committing genocide against them. That becomes an open door, an opportunity to demonstrate the truth. It's not a golden opportunity. It's just a crack in the door. It's going to require rolling up our sleeves and doing a lot of hard work. And we've got to have a multi-generational vision. We Americans like quick fixes. We want stuff done fast. And what we've got to realize is that this is going to take time. And it's going to take dramatic investment over the course of time. That's why I'm committed to raising up a whole new generation of leaders. I don't think I'm going to see dramatic change in my lifetime, no matter how old I live. What I would like to see is that these young people raise up a new generation of leaders to follow them, and us commit over the long haul to a multi-generational plan of genuine transformation in the world. That's the only way that it's going to work. We're not going to have a 100-hour war and win this. We may be able to get rid of Saddam, and that may be a good thing. It will certainly relieve me of the thought of not being able to go to Times Square for fear of a suitcase bomb, but it's not going to solve the problem long term.
One last question.
The Crusades are a very complex series of episodes in the conflict between the West and Islam. We have to understand that the Crusades were not one thing or two things or three things. The Crusades took place over the course of about 700 years. So lots of people and lots of movements can occur over 700 years. Originally, the Crusades were conceived as a rescue operation with a lot more warrant even than us going into Kuwait. If you accept the just war theory of Augustine, the Crusades were conceived, at least, entirely as a just war to relieve the oppression of Christian brothers, churches, sites, and nations that had been conquered by Islam. Now, the Crusades were messy. There were lots of personalities. There was a lot of greed and oppression that came along with them. Of course, that happens in any war. War involves killing. Killing is problematical for 18-year-olds with the ultimate power to take a life. You're looking at a huge opportunity for abuse, and the Crusades had plenty of abuse. So we don't want to justify the Crusades, but I also think that it is foolish for us to instantly denounce the Crusades as being morally bereft simply because we're doing the exact same thing. Our whole reason to go to Kuwait, our whole reason to remove the threat of Saddam's biological weapons would compare, I think, favorably to the reasons that the original Crusades were called. By the way, the Crusades did not end until Napoleon. Napoleon was the last leader of a great crusade in 1798.
Not a question, but just simply a statement. Ignorance is going to be our downfall.
I think you're right. I think ignorance has been our downfall. This is one of the reasons why Jesus exhorts us toward freedom. And it is the truth of the gospel, the truth of the way the world works that sets us free. Where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is liberty.